Welcome to the Bible class of Jews for Jesus with Bob Mendelsohn.
Hi everybody, welcome to Bible class, and we're continuing 1 Corinthians, and tonight we're in chapter 8, a fairly short chapter. You might think when we read a passage about things sacrificed to idols that we're talking about a Thailand shrine or something that would be outside a home in Tibet, or that basically we could say it's so foreign it has no relation to us. However, as we always see in Scripture, there's a principle that's going to be applied that is very meaningful and defining for us as people. And it's about generosity. It's about giving for the sake of the other. This is the theme that the apostle here is using. He's answering a question. He's already answered what do we do with the virgins, and what do we do about remarriage, and what do we do about that brother who's sleeping with his stepmother. We've already talked about all that. We've already talked about judgment and going to court against your brother. Not on. Can't do that. Now, concerning things sacrificed to idols, we know we all have knowledge, he says. Knowledge, though, only makes you think you're somebody when you're nothing. Because if you really think you know something, you don't yet know as you ought to know. The more you know, isn't that one of those things we learned when we were just young? That the more we know we don't know. And anybody who forgets that is often reminded that by their children. The more you know you don't know. And that is a humility that comes from experience, isn't it? When you're a kid, you think you know everything. And then you take an exam and you find out, well, I didn't exactly know everything, but the stupid teacher didn't teach me that. But I know it now. And then as we get older and older, we realize, I don't know very much at all. And I listen to them talk about economic forecasts, and I realize I did take economics in school, but I don't know anything. I was a high school math teacher, but my knowledge of maths is so faded and gone that I couldn't even help an HSC student right now get through 4-unit. I couldn't do that. But even if it were a subject about which I'm very familiar, like Bible, the more you read the Bible, the more you know that you don't know what the Bible says. Humility is a function of real knowledge. So he's saying, if anyone supposes, I love that in verse 2, that he knows anything, you can almost hear the pshaw. He has not yet known as he ought to know. And then he switches to love. Right in the middle of this controversy about idolatry, which, by the way, is the Greek word.
But he's talking about love, because love edifies.
Right, but that came out of nowhere. Yeah, he did mention love, and it's come up now kind of right in our face. And he's going to compare knowledge and love. He's going to contrast them. We're going to look at 3 different contrasts or conflicts, why love is better than knowledge. But if you're talking about knowing things in verse 2 and verse 3, known by him, you'd think he'd stay on knowing, but he switches to love. Anyone who is loving God, anyone who loves God is known by him, which means don't show off. God knows you, and he doesn't have weak knowledge. He has complete knowledge. So be realistic about what you don't know. And if you'll do that, then we can keep talking about how we handle the controversy of idolatry and eating food that was sacrificed to idols. The principle is generosity towards others. The specifics is food that was sacrificed. Now, we know that from Jewish things, from the book of Leviticus. We studied that at great length. And so we know that the priests would often eat not every sacrifice, but many of the sacrifices, and there were several types, 6 types we studied, but some of them were given to the priest for him and his family. But one steer will feed an awful lot of folk. If you kill one steer or a cow, you're not just going to say, well, that goes to Mr. Cohen, the priest, and his 4 children, because they didn't have refrigeration like we understand it. That would have all gone off. Think of it more like a matador. You know what the word matar means? A matador is not a bull fighter, but a bull killer. Matar means to kill. Well, in the neighborhood of a bullfight in Spain or Mexico, Argentina, wherever, when there's a bullfight, they kill the bull, and that afternoon, all the meat is butchered and provided to the village for a price. So think of it that way. Here's a thing sacrificed to idols. So it might be a little lamb, it might be a little sheep, it might be a little dog. I don't know. This was sacrificed in a Corinthian temple, not a Jewish temple. It might be a pig, might be anything. So it's sacrificed to an idol. Well, the priest will then go and have it butchered. He might be the butcher. And now it's available. And you could go to the neighborhood cafe and get leftover food sacrificed to idol. That's the theme that he's talking about, because we see that in verse 10. For if someone sees you who have knowledge dining in an idol's temple. So it's as if you're at the neighborhood restaurant next door to the temple. And if you are sitting there eating at the cafe of Idolatry, Molech manner, and some believer walks past you, won't he stumble, thinking that you've now agreed with, at least in measure, the idolatrous practices, and you're in agreement, and you're going to reap the benefits of it. So that's what's going on. Now, we don't think in those terms because, again, we don't do idol worship and idol sacrifices. But I want you to get the principle as we think about ideas like drinking, alcohol, which for some is a real stumbling block. They either had some history of drunkenness, or their father did, or for whatever reason, they are committed to not drink. There are those who are committed to only eat kosher food. I'm one of them. There are those who say that we shouldn't go to certain movies or watch certain television shows. There's all kinds of regulations that believers put on one another, usually on themselves first and then on others, and say, if you do that, I question whether you're really a believer. The theme here is generosity towards those who might stumble. If I do it, stop doing it. Why? Because love is greater than knowledge. So you might know that sacrifice to an idol is not going to hurt anybody. And what does he say? He says, we do know this. We all know that, verse 4, there's no such thing as an idol. What? How could there be no such thing as an idol? Because what he's saying is it's a bunch of wood and stone. It's not a real God. No such thing as an idol. That's the Greek word. And that there is no God but one. That's true. We all agree with that. There's only one God. If that be so, then these phony gods are not even real gods. So not even worth being considered as a god. So if they sacrifice to a priest or to a dog or to a block of stone, fine. It's not going to affect anything. So he's speaking from the side of freedom. I think false gods exist because people wanted to have something that would help them particularly. So there's the god of the Nile River, or the god of the harvest. I play golf with guys and they talk about the god of golf. I'm going to hit that. Well, it's now up to the gods where that ball landed. And I think, well, that's how it played out, I imagine, the deification of something of my own wish or imagination. Unsanctified imagination gets you in trouble. But sanctified imagining is good. No God but one. For even if there were, verse 5, so-called gods, whether in heaven or earth or New Zealand, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, wait a minute, Paul, are there or aren't there? See, it's a little confusing unless you realize he's taken the mickey out of anybody who really believes in gods. He says, verse 4, there is no such thing as an idol. Verse 5, there are many gods and many lords. He's saying that you clowns who don't know go ahead and make things as if they are, but they're nothing. They're phantom gods. They're not real, but you treat them as real. You remember the story of Abraham and how he became a follower of the one true God. His father being an idol maker and seller. You made him, you sold him. Great story. You know the story? You want to tell it?
What happened was Abraham went to his father's shop where he was selling those idols, and there were so many idols. So you know what he did? He knocked down all the idols, every single one, big and small, and he put the hammer on the hand of the idol that was the strongest. So when his father came in, he says, son, what have you done? You've broken all my idols down. Father, I didn't do it. That other idol, the strongest one, knocked them all down. He said to him, are you foolish? An idol can't speak or talk or do. How could you tell me that?
So Abraham answered and said, so Father, why do you believe in things that can't speak or talk or do?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
Exactly.
Terach, Father's name.
That's from the Talmud.
It is Talmudic. So there's so-called gods, but they're not real gods. But for us, verse 6, there is one God, the Father from whom are all things. We exist for him, and one Lord, Yeshua the Messiah, by whom are all things, we exist through him. But why doesn't he mention Holy Spirit? Because this isn't an explanation of the Trinity. This is an explanation of God. So he's not trying to teach who the triune God is, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. What he's saying is, hey, all those other gods are fake gods. There's only one. And we all agree with that. Shema Yisrael. There's one God. And this note about one Lord, Yeshua the Messiah, is in contrast to Caesar. Not saying Jesus is a diminished God, anything like, he's not God Jr. What it's saying is, you guys all think there are deities, and Caesar is Lord. That was the common Roman declaration. Well, Yeshua is. That was a big thing that got a lot of Jewish believers and Gentiles, I'm sure, in trouble in the Roman era. So he's making it clear there's not a Caesar Lord, there's not a, all your gods aren't gods, and we've got not only the real God, we got the real Lord. Not two, so again, he's not teaching triune. However, not all men have this knowledge. So we've got to work on something that goes beyond knowledge or greater than knowledge. And he talks about love being just that. Knowledge is general. Look what he says in verse 1. We all know that we all have knowledge. It's so general. Sort of like we say, did you know that tomorrow's Melbourne Cup? Everybody knows that, you could say. We all know that. Knowledge has this general nature to it, but love has a specific nature to it. Love individualizes. So he's calling us to something greater than general thought. Something, because that knowledge can make you arrogant, puffed up. But love builds the house. That's what the word edifies means. Oikodome. So knowledge is general and love is specific. I like that about what God does. Secondly, love evaluates properly. Verse 3, if anyone loves God, he's known by him. You'd think it would say, if anyone loves God, he knows God, as if it were our agency and his the receiver. But it's quite the opposite, because if you love God, you know that you are known by him. It gives you a sense of humility. It gives you a sense of his honor and not about your own pride. It actually goes exactly contrary to knowledge, which puffs up. If you love God, you realize, man, he knows everything. He loves me even so. It gives you a great sense of praise and thanksgiving to say, I'm loved by God. He is awesome. I read my diary today from 1973. Somebody sent me an email and asked a question about something from that era, and I said, well, let me look it up. So I look it up, and I find I get so distracted. Do you ever do that? You're looking in an encyclopedia for something, and you end up spending an hour and a half reading that whole silly book, and it's the greatest thing. So I'm reading through my whole journal of what I was feeling and doing and thinking, and it was some very silly, because I was 21, 22 years old, and some very deep and meaningful. I tried to be profound. I was reading and thinking, you clown, you didn't know anything. But I was trying to be so profound in my language. My rhetoric was so polished. But what I kept seeing in there was a real awareness of God knowing me. And I couldn't get away with anything. I'd become a believer about a year and a half earlier. And I was overwhelmed with his knowledge of me. And everything was about him and what he was thinking and doing on the planet. I just wanted to be in his world. That was so cool to read that today in light of our study tonight, known by him. So love allows us to think more clearly, because when you get up into the realm of God's thoughts, you now are able to evaluate, judge, and discern more clearly. That's what he also says here towards the end. The third is at the end, and that is that if we offend anyone, verse 12, then we sin against Messiah. That it's not just I'm sinning against Joe, my brother, or Menachem. I'm sinning against Messiah. How does that work? You remember Yeshua taught a parable about sheep and goats. And he said that the sheep are on one side, if you will, of heaven, and the goats are on the other side in a judgment sense. In Matthew chapter 25, he said, the sheep get up there and they say, how'd this happen? How'd we get to become sheep? I didn't know I was going to be a sheep. And he says, what you did to the least of these, my brothers, you've done to me. And to the goats, he said, what you've done, in a bad way, to my brothers, you've done to me. So Yeshua so identifies with his people that what you do to them, you're actually doing to him. We looked at that in the book of Ephesians, and earlier in this book when we considered the word body, the body of Messiah. What is a body if Messiah is the head, if Yeshua is the head, and we're the body? Then what people do to the body, they're doing to him. Does that make sense? Corporally? So it's beyond physical. It's also in the spiritual realm. You remember in Acts chapter 9, the Apostle Saul becomes a believer. It's a great tale. Let's take a look real quick at Acts chapter 9. And he's traveling along. Verse 3, a light from heaven flashes around him. He falls to the ground. He hears a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, who are you, Lord? And he said, I'm Yeshua, whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and it'll be told you must do. Now, wait a minute. Who was, chapter 9, sir? He's not confessing Jesus as Lord. But verse 1 says, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and then asked for letters, and he took the letters, and he went out, and he was all set to keep up the persecution of the believers. But he's not persecuting believers according to this. Who's he persecuting? He's persecuting Messiah. Verse 4, why are you persecuting me? What you do to believers, you do to Messiah. So that first phrase that Messiah himself gave to Paul so settled in him that he's constantly pinging that in his refrain about the body. Here he teaches that in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse number 12. We'll go back to 1 Corinthians 8, verse 12. And so by sinning against the brethren and wounding their conscience when it's weak, you sin against Messiah. What you do to the believers, you're doing to him. Wow. That puts humility in perspective. That puts generosity in perspective, what I want to do towards the weaker brother. When the apostle uses the term weaker brother in Romans and here in Corinthians, he's talking about those who are the preventing brothers, the ones who say we can't do things. Whereas Club Freedom, the people in Club Freedom say, it doesn't matter. Yes, I can go have a scotch and soda. It's not going to kill you. Others say, you can't do that because you'll lose, your salvation, whatever. And so if you don't eat or don't drink, you're called, according to Paul, weaker. However, in a generous world, not in a Darwinian world, the stronger serves the weaker. It's not the survival of the fittest, it's the survival of all of us, because what we do to others, we do to Messiah. So if somebody's weaker than me and thinks that they can't have alcohol, well, I'm not going to flaunt it in front of them, but I do. In Australia, it's a funny thing because we live by drink. Golly. Kevin Rudd wins, and let's toast, and let's open some champagne. The Melbourne Cup, let's have champagne. Everything. Let's drink, eat, drink. The grand final. There are plenty of people who drink around the globe. I'm saying it's endemic here in a very thick way.
The culture.
It is. Yeah, and then the same government that celebrates with drink says to the young people, don't drink and drive. Drive responsibly. Drink responsibly. How many do you need to? So it's a tough call on that. Those who say we shouldn't ought to drink come up with Bible verses. And they'll say wine's a mocker and strong drink's a liar, stay away from it. And those who do drink say, yeah, but here the apostle says wine's good for your stomach, have a little. And Jesus gave them wine, and they had that at the dinner, at the Last Supper, at Passover Seder. And anybody who's really never been to Israel can say that, but you've been to Israel, you know that hot air, there's no way to keep grape juice from not fermenting, right? So it's going to become wine fairly quickly. So all those instances of freedom versus regulated are moderated by this generous idea, this idea that the stronger ought to be more generous than the weaker. Some will say, in light of our original question, that if you go eat at the sandwich shop next door to the temple where they sacrifice to idols, it's not going to kill you because they're not real anyway. That's what he's saying. They're not real idols, so go eat the sandwich. Say you're a weak brother and you don't think we ought to eat stuff at that sandwich shop of idols. You walk by and you see Ezra and Jerry in there having a sandwich. You know that was just offered to a demon an hour ago. And now you think, I thought Ezra and Jerry were believers. I don't know, I'm so confused. I wish I was. So for their sake, for the weak brother's sake, then don't eat it. It's the simplest thing. Don't eat it. I'd rather, he said, look, food causes my brother to stumble. I'm not going to ever eat meat again. If that's it, that's easy. That's an easy solve. Well, it's respect for Messiah and that he has saved that weaker brother.
But this is becoming an issue now in this country because all the abattoirs are being sold to Muslims and they are being offered up to Allah. would be made halal.
Yeah, I got an email about 6 months ago, and I got another one yesterday about Cadbury chocolates having a halal symbol on there. And you know what that means? And I think, yeah, it means that they can eat it. It has nothing to do with me.
The conscious thing.
Dedicated to Hashem. But is it dedicated? It's not that it's dedicated, it's that it's clean enough that an Orthodox Jew can eat it. And it was prepared in a certain way. So those who don't know Islamic rule, Islamic laws, say, see the halal? That means they've dedicated it to a false god. Really? That's not their usual way of saying it. And what it really means, Ahmad, ordinary Muslim, can eat that Cadbury chocolate. That's what it really means. If somebody privately at the Cadbury chocolate factory bows down to Allah and prays over that piece of chocolate and you don't want to eat it, okay, I'll never, if you're the weaker brother, I will not eat Cadbury chocolate in your place wherever you are. I just won't do it anymore. See how the principle works? If it's going to stumble somebody, and the Greek word cause my brother to stumble is scandalize, skandalizo. Matthew 18. The disciples came to Yeshua and said, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" What a question to ask the Messiah. He called a child to himself and set him before them and said, "Amen, I say to you, unless you're converted and become like children, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he's the greatest. Whoever receives such a child in my name receives me." There it is. There's that linkage again between those who represent us and Yeshua himself. And verse 6, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to be scandalized, to stumble, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks. Inevitable that they come, but woe to the man through whom the stumbling block comes. If your hand or foot causes you to stumble, so you get the idea. Stumbling blocks are going to come, but it's better if you're not the one who drops it in front of somebody. One more verse, and that's Leviticus 19. Back to the Older Testament. You shall not oppress your neighbor, nor rob him. The wages of a hired man are not to remain with you all night until morning. I still hear that because we get bills here at Jews for Jesus. And sometimes it says it's a 7-day account. Sometimes it's a 21-day account. I've got one guy who says, "Can you pay me the moment I send you the bill?" And I think, well, that's not usual, but the wages of a hired man should not be with me overnight. If I've got the money and he sends me a bill, what am I doing with the money? It's his money. I owe him. So pay him right then. I prefer doing that anyway. Verse 14, you shall not curse a deaf man. What's wrong with that? Deaf man won't hear you.
And it doesn't matter whether he can hear you or not. You have still spoken death over him.
Yep.
It still has spiritual ramifications.
And the second half says, nor shall you place a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your God. Signed God. That's what I'm the Lord. Then verse 18, you shall not take vengeance. You shall not bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So here it is. Love is the summary of not giving stumbling block to your brother. So when Paul cites this back in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, he's citing Vayikra and the centerpiece of a real relationship between Jewish people. Between all people now, it's extended to all people. If food causes my brother to be offended, if there's a stumbling block in front of my brother because of food, or bowling, or drinking alcohol, or dancing, smoking cigarettes, I'm not going to ever smoke cigarettes again. If that's going to cause my brother, I'm just not going to do it. That's right. We learn about secondhand smoke and how deadly that is for spouses and family members who live in that. The rates of lung cancer and emphysema are almost as high in secondary smoke than it is for the primary smoker.
Can I just share something? I've got a neighbour across the road and she's a very young Christian and she's really struggling with that I choose to eat a different way. And she has not done what the passage has said. So because she has another view, she then deliberately serves me food which is contemptible to me, to force it on me that we are now free and we can eat whatever we want. So the other day she gave me a dish and the meat, half of it was lamb and the other half was pork. And she did on purpose because she knows that I will not, cannot, and with all good conscience cannot. She keeps saying, but it's not like this, you have to, you have to, you have to.
So maybe God has.
I'm sharing this because the danger is there are a lot of people out there as Christians who want all Christians to be uniform, to be exactly the same. They're not allowed to have conscience one doing this and one doing that, one convicted by this and one convicted by that.
So you can say to her, what if I was vegetarian? Would you still give me meat to eat?
Or gluten intolerant, or lactose intolerant. Who's the real intolerant one?
Or diabetic.
Well, this is the question, and that's what verse 1 says. Knowledge puffs up. So instead of building up Ori, she's building herself up. And that's exactly what the apostle is arguing against. Knowledge, yes, you know that doesn't matter. So since she knows that pork is not going to kill you, so here, have the pork. But instead of honoring the weaker, that's what the Bible would call you, and weaker, that's what it says. It's okay. Instead of honoring our weakness, they trumpet it and flaunt it. And that's just not on. That's not the biblical way. Don't put a stumbling block in front of your blind neighbor.
But didn't the Christian misunderstand?
Kosher laws?
Yeah.
Sure. They misunderstand a lot. So many things. Well, they see that Jew and Gentile are now one, and they want us to be their one instead of our one.
Yeah.
How good is it when you know that your neighbor is diabetic, and you make them diabetic-free cookies or something, sugar-free things? That is honoring to the person. It's love. And that is so simple. But for some reason, some people don't get it. Look at verse 9. Take care that this liberty of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. The word liberty is exousia, the Greek word for authority. Take care that this authority of yours doesn't somehow become a stumbling block. So it's liberty based on your understanding of God's authority. And you've got that knowledge, you've got the authority, you can go eat that sandwich at the idol shop, but don't do it. Don't stumble your brother on that. So this is all about generosity, all about regarding each other as more important than ourselves. One of the phrases I used back in 73, and I liked, and I'm going to start using again, is dive for the bottom. Man, that's a good word. Dive for the bottom. When you have an opportunity to be lower than your brother, dive, take it. It's kind of weird, isn't it? Humility always wins. So when you get to an end game where you know you're going to lose, or they're going to lose, or it's a no-win situation, let them win. Well, husbands and wives do that all the time if they're smart. Look, verse 8, food will not commend us to God. The word commend, the Greek word is paristemi, and it has to do with presenting somebody, standing beside them, coming up. It's a bystander in one case, but the food is not the announcer who's going to bring us up to God. Food doesn't matter. The principle is none of this matters. It's all going to wash. And he's going to do something like that in chapter 9. The phrase, do you not know, is in the New Testament 10 times, all in 1 Corinthians. Don't you know, which means you ought to know. And here he is knocking knowledge, but he's not. He's just saying, put knowledge in perspective. 6 times in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Don't you know the saints will judge the world? Verse 3, don't you know that we will judge angels? So, don't you know that? The apostle said we will. So, that's why I'm saying we know so much and we know so little. Don't you know we'll judge angels? You ever pondered that? I have no idea how that's going to work. So, he who thinks he knows something doesn't yet know as he ought to know.
You've been listening to the Bible class of Jews for Jesus in Australia. For more information, contact Jews for Jesus, Post Office Box 925, Sydney, Australia 2001. God bless you.